Hello and welcome to the four-part series to help you write a winning SBIR STTR proposal. In today's discussion, Eva Garland Consultants will touch upon SBIR STTR budgeting and building your team. Today's webinar is brought to you by University Lab Partners in partnership with Eva Garland Consulting. My name is Teresa Fry. I'm the events coordinator at University Lab Partners. And as we get started, I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to ULP.
Hi, I'm Karen Cook, Executive Director at University Lab Partners. University Lab Partners really serves three critical roles here in Orange County. First and foremost, we support life science innovators and entrepreneurs by providing wet lab space and critical infrastructure. Second, we serve as a landing ground for life science innovation. We provide networking and educational opportunities so life science innovators really have a place to call home. But most importantly, University Lab Partners serves as a catalyst in this region for workforce development activities in the life science space here. We truly believe as our companies are creating great jobs, we need to serve as an active agent to develop that talent pipeline for this sector.
What makes our hands-on laboratory experiences unique is the fact that they are led by our life science innovators that are actually here working within our space. These instructors bring their real-world experience and applications into the classroom as the students are using industry-standard techniques and equipment.
With our expansion here in the Orange County community, we look to serve more innovators and students all across Orange County.
Thank you. As our Executive Director Karen mentioned before, University Lab Partners is a nonprofit premier wet lab tech incubator located in the UCI Research Park in Irvine, California. We provide researchers with over 22,000 square feet of scientific resources, contributing to the acceleration of innovation in Orange County. Our benefits encompass flexible lab and office space, state-of-the-art scientific equipment, access to UCI's technical core resources, and on-site experts and residents. We provide extensive support for your commercialization endeavors through a wide array of resources and activities. And don't forget to connect with us on various platforms as you see here. We always appreciate hearing from you. A little housekeeping before we get started here. We are going to begin and everybody is muted during the webinar. There'll be a Q&A at the end of the presentation, but feel free to ask questions during the webinar by writing them in the chat box. We may not get to everybody's questions, but we'll do our best. Most importantly, the recorded presentation will be shared with you in a follow-up email. Today's webinar will be presented by Brandon Turner.
Well, thank you again, Teresa, for the introduction, and thank you to University Lab Partners for hosting us today and allow us to present this webinar series. On behalf of Eva Garland Consulting, it's my pleasure to be able to work here with you today. This is part 2 of our SBIR and STTR seminar series, and today we're going to be discussing budgeting and building your team. So to kind of reiterate a little bit about my background, as Teresa mentioned, I'm a scientific consultant and grant writing specialist here at EGC. I have my PhD in neuroscience from Vanderbilt University, then moved on to do a postdoctoral fellowship under an F32 through the NIH Brain Initiative at Duke University. As she mentioned, my technical expertise is primarily in biotechnology, ex vivo assays, pharmaceutical sciences, and diagnostics assays in preclinical models. For my clients, I've performed numerous work, including technology assessments, assisting product development, proposal preparation, gap analyses, and strategic planning. And I've worked on numerous proposals and secured SBIR and STTR funding, as well as other non-dilutive funding from the NIH, NSF, DoD, as well as the EDA. So a brief agenda of what we're going to talk about today. So again, today is all about budgets and building your team. So we'll start going over the SBIR and STTR budget requirements for those of you who are new to the mechanism or exploring the mechanism for the first time. Next, we'll go into a bit of detail about direct versus indirect, as well as internal versus external costs and how they influence your application. We'll talk briefly about working with research partners. These include nonprofit research institutions, as well as CROs and other fee-for-service vendors. Following the budget discussion, we'll talk a little bit about key personnel and gap analyses and how you can perform them to better round out your team. And then we'll spend a few minutes at the end talking about some post-award procedures and expectations to prepare you for what comes after you win an SBIR STTR award. So first, let's talk about the budget requirements. Now, I start with budget, and many of you may be thinking, the budget is not the most exciting part of my project. I want to talk about my science. I want to talk about my innovation. Why do I need to start thinking about budget, and how does it impact my project? Well, budgets are incredibly important in that they can be the defining factor in deciding between numerous issues. First and foremost, in deciding between SBIR and the STTR mechanisms. While these are both mechanisms that will support small businesses, they are unique in the way the budget must be allocated for each award. As you may recall from the first webinar, for SBIR awards, at least 67% of the work allocated by budget must be performed by the applicant's small business, whereas STTR awards require at least 40% of the work to be performed by the applicant's small business. So knowing what your budget is and where you plan to allocate those different funds can help you decide between these two mechanisms. Additionally, the budget can help you determine what is feasible in terms of project scope. This accounts for the budget caps that are placed on different award phases and aligning those caps with what you plan to do within your product development pipeline. If you have extensive early work to show proof of concept, and you know this will fit within a phase 1 budget, that may be for you. But if you have a more mature technology that has already shown proof of concept and you need more funding to support something like extensive biocompatibility testing or even clinical work, you may need to apply for phase 2 instead. Additionally, thinking about budgets upfront can be important as they vary by agency, that is across institutions like the National Science Foundation, the Department of Defense, or the National Institute of Health, as well as within intra-agency funding institutes, such as the multiple institutes and centers within the National Institute of Health. Knowing that these budgets vary can again help you determine which agency and institute you might want to apply to. By knowing how much your project will cost, these can limit these options and help you initiate discussions to help move forward with a fruitful funding outcome. And then finally, thinking about budgets early can help you determine who you can pay to support your project. This is an important note for SBIR and STTR awards, as they do not allow foreign components, and all work, including personnel, vendors, and expenditures, must be performed within the United States, with a rare subset of exceptions. So knowing this, let's talk a bit more about the specific requirements and considerations for SBI and STTR budgets. If you're coming from an academic background, you're probably familiar with this first aspect of a grant budget, and that is direct costs. Most academic research grants are often limited or capped based on the total direct cost you can spend on a project, and these are related to the specific activities listed in the research strategy and performed within the project period. However, unlike those typical academic grants, SBIR and STTR budgets are limited based on total costs. That is, they include direct costs as well as indirects and a profit fee. These specific caps do vary again based on phase of the award and the agency you're applying to. But my point with this slide is to impress upon you the need to consider these additional costs when planning your project. It won't simply be the items on your budget. You'll need to account for indirects and fee as well. Thinking on these budget caps and limitations, it's important to note that these totals can vary based on the awarding agency, announcement, and SBIR mechanism. For example, the top line showing here is a solicitation for the NIH Omnibus SBIR award, where awards were capped at roughly $306,000 for phase 1 and $2 million for phase 2. It's important to note that within the NIH, you can actually exceed these budget mechanisms or maximums, pardon me, if your project falls within a specific topic. Listed here in blue, you can see a link to the program descriptions to the NIH, where they list special budget waiver topics for each institute or center participating in this award announcement. If your grant fits into one of these topics, you may be eligible for a budget waiver, which can allow you to exceed these budget mechanisms. It's important to be aware that these budget topics exist to allow you to capitalize on the additional funding that may be available to you when applying to an award. Additionally, while many agencies have broad SBIR and STTR announcements, such as the omnibus listed up top, different agencies also release specific topics for SBIR and STTR awards. Listed below is a specific SBIR and STTR RFA on advancing research on Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's disease-related dementias. This is a specific call through the National Institute of Aging and National Institute of Neurological Disorders of Stroke, where if your project fits within the purview of this program and the agency's interest, you're eligible to apply for up to $450,000 for a phase 1 and $2.5 million for a phase 2. Again, it is important to pay attention to the agency-specific budget guidance and the target NOFOs, which can help you shape the project and decide which agency and institute you'll be applying to. In addition to the budget cap, it's important to be aware of the distinction between internal and external budget. And I'm going to touch on this briefly, but we will go into this in a little more detail further on. So first, again, for SBIR awards, at least 67% of the budget must be directed to the SBC for a phase 1, and at least 50% must go to the SBC for phase 2, whereas STTR, you're required to allocate at least 40% of the budget to the small business concern, and at least 30% to a partnering research institution. These costs are determined based on internal expenditures. That is, 67% of the budget refers to 67% of the budget being spent on company activities. The external portion of the budget contributes to the remainder of that percentage and can also be used to contribute to that minimum 30% required for partnering research institutions. It is important to understand that these distinctions are based on these internal and external expenditures and are defined by the SBA, not the funding agency. As such, these percentages do not vary across funding agencies. Additional things to consider when applying for an SBIR and STTR. First is the indirect cost calculation. As mentioned before, you will need to account for total cost on your project when applying and building your budget. This includes calculating indirect costs for activities performed during the project period. This will be covered a little in detail a little bit further on, but for the most part, you understand that indirect costs can be requested at a rate contingent on total direct cost spend without negotiation. This is an allowance that the SBIR and STTR program gives you, particularly for the NIH. Small businesses can request 40% of total direct costs as indirect costs without justification. Note that this percentage does vary based on agency. For example, the NSF allows SBCs to request 50% of the total salaries and wages as indirect costs. And again, keep this in mind when starting to build your budget. Lastly, it's important to note that you will need to justify your budget. All of your expenses will need an explanation. Again, if you're coming from a clinically academic background and have worked with those awards in the past, you may be familiar with modular budgets that agencies such as the NIH allow you to fill out, where you don't need to go into detail about how certain project milestones are going to be accounted for on the budget sheet. However, an SBIR and STTR award does require you to provide an itemized budget. This is going to include justifying large expenses, typically including items and materials, supplies that are over $1,000 each, where you can justify them with quotes. Additionally, any vendors or CROs you're partnering with will also need to provide quotes. Consultants you're working with should be able to provide their rates and an estimated expenditure on the project. And if you're working with subawards, that is specific university partners, they will also need to provide their own budget and justification along with several other pieces of documentation. It's important to note that these items do take time. Quotes, budget justifications, and estimates from CROs and consultants can take several weeks up to months to get in place. Additionally, if you're working with university partners, several of them may set internal deadlines prior to funding filing, that is weeks ahead of the actual deadline you are targeting. With that in mind, be aware that these items do take time, and as soon as you start thinking of a project, start thinking of your budget. Okay, having gone over the broad requirements for SBIR and STTR awards, I next want to touch base on direct and indirect costs and internal and external costs in more detail. So broadly, cost types on an SBIR and STTR award can fall into 3 different buckets. Direct costs, which again are project costs directly related to the performance of the activities written in your proposal. Indirect costs, which are related to non-specific activities associated with the performance of the project, as well as a profit fee, which you're allowed to request as part of the SBIR and STTR program. Important of stressing this point here is to understand that these costs vary in terms of their flexibility. Direct costs are typically rather rigid and are restricted to what is specifically requested within the budget. Although these can be shifted along with discussions with the funding agency if needed. However, I highly recommend that you assume that these costs are fixed. Conversely, indirect costs are more flexible and can be requested as needed during the course of the project, so long as they are in accordance with the initial amount requested on the budget and accompany indirect cost spend. Finally, the fee is the most flexible and can be used for anything the applicant wishes. Digging a bit further into the individual cost types, direct costs, as I mentioned, are related directly to the performance of the R&D objectives of the grant. These are the costs that need to be enumerated and described in detail in the accompanying budget justification that should provide line item descriptions of different materials and supplies, as well as justify key personnel salaries, describe travel related to the grant, and provide details or allude to quotes or estimates provided by subaward and subcontractor partners. Unique to direct costs is their ability to be split between internal and external on the company's budget. Again, internal costs contribute directly to the small business's effort as far as compliance with the SBIR and STTR guidelines, and can contain things like the personnel salaries, materials and supplies, lab space rental, and travel that are these costs that are incurred by the business itself. It can also include certain items such as fee-for-service vendors that you decide to hire as part of the project. External costs are related to third parties, such as academic collaborators and other businesses, typically providing custom work for the project. And this can also pertain to consultants, i.e. people that you bring on to expand the team and perform work or expand the expertise within your company. Moving on, indirect costs, also commonly known as facilities and administrative costs or general and administrative costs, pertain to non-R&D expenses incurred during the conducting the project activities. These are things like utilities, rent, other overhead, and can also extend to certain activities related to grant compliance, including grant accounting and certain compliance filing activities required post-award. Notably, the allowable rate for indirect costs does vary based on the grant opportunity and whether you have a negotiated rate with the federal government. A few things to consider about indirect costs. First, unlike direct costs, which are split into internal and external, all indirect costs are considered internal for the SBC. They are paid directly to your company, and on your budget, you will request them to perform company activities, not external activities. Indirect costs are calculated using a base amount multiplied by a rate, which again can be set by the institution up to a certain allowable maximum on phase 1 or phase 2 SBIR awards, or at a negotiated rate. The indirect cost base is typically derived from all or a portion of direct costs. These again are your project costs. The portion of the direct costs you can claim as an indirect cost base does vary based on agency, and there are specific guidelines to tell you what to use. For example, the National Institute of Health recommends that you use the total direct project costs, or rather allows the SBC to request up to use the total direct project costs as this indirect cost base. Conversely, the National Science Foundation allows applicants to use the total personnel salaries and wages as the direct cost base when calculating indirect overhead. Important to note here that the inclusion of subaward indirect costs may be restricted. That is, certain agencies restrict the amount of a subaward you can use to claim indirect costs on top of. That is, how much of it you can include as part of your indirect cost base. If you have questions about this and are partnering with a university and are unsure how much of the subaward costs you can include in this calculation, we highly recommend you reach out to agency staff so they can provide additional guidance on how to proceed with your budget. And again, indirect cost rate also varies based on agency, but a few examples shown below. NIH allows applicants to take up to 40% of their cost base as indirect costs, whereas the NSF allows rates up to 50%. Important to note is that these rates can be negotiated. However, if you are a first-time SBIR applicant, it is highly unlikely that you have a negotiated rate unless you're a more mature business or have worked on federal grants in the past. As such, we recommend that you use the allowed rates when applying for the first time, and following performance of the award and generating records of expenditure of indirect costs on federal funding, you can then consider going back to the government for indirect rates. Important to note that while indirect costs are more flexible than their direct cost comparators, there are some restrictions as to what is allowed and what's not allowed. In general, indirect costs are not as easily identified, but can be used for several specific things or common items on applications. Particularly fringe benefits can be claimed. This includes allowances, services provided to employees, sick leave, payroll taxes, and health insurance. Fringe can also be requested as part of direct cost. However, if you are a first-time applicant or a new business and do not have an established fringe rate for your employees, you can omit that on the direct costs and draw them down from indirect costs as they are allowed. Other items include overhead. This includes indirect costs related to performance of the project, labor on overhead, benefits on that overhead, as well as facility costs and depreciation. And finally, general administrative fees pertain to indirect costs associated with the overall management of the company. This can also include administrative labor, fringe benefits on G&A labor, professional fees, and office supplies. There are also certain items that are unallowed for SBIR and STTR awards. Most relevant for many of the folks who are probably in the room today are patent costs and market research. Patent costs are expressly unallowed except for general counseling services on patent matters. That is, you cannot use indirect costs to pay for the filing of a patent. However, you can use indirect costs occasionally to pay for IP consultation. Additionally, travel costs are generally discouraged for being used as indirects. However, you can list them as direct costs on your budget and delineate them in your detailed breakdown of project activities. Finally, market research is not supported by SBIR and STTR funds as either direct or indirect costs and cannot typically be used to support commercialization. That being said, there are specific follow-on funding that you can request, such as the technical and business assistance available through the National Institute of Health that will support market research to phase 1 awardees. Of note, many of the examples I provided here for allowable and unallowable indirect costs are taken from the NIH's description of the grants policy statement. You can see a more comprehensive list of those you're using the NIH grant policy statement linked here. However, many of the cost types and whether or not they are allowed are listed by the different agencies on the funding guidelines. If you do have any questions about what would be allowed or unallowed as far as indirect costs, we do highly recommend that you consider speaking with agency staff either prior to applying or prior to listing it as a cost. The final cost type that I'd like to go over is the profit fee. This is unique to SBIR and STTR applications and is your incentive to apply to the program. Profit fee is typically calculated at around 7% of the total direct and indirect costs listed on the project. Much like indirects, profit fee is considered an internal cost and will contribute to the 67% minimum effort for SBCs on phase 1 SBIR awards, as well as the 40% minimum on STTR awards. And as I noted earlier, the fee can be used for any expense. A few tips when requesting and using the profit fee. First, the fee does not need to be justified. Unlike the direct costs, which need to be delineated, you do not need to state what you plan to use the fee for. According to the SBA, in the budget justification, it's not important to elaborate on how you spend it because it's not relevant. What is relevant is that you are allowed to request this fee and what you request is reasonable. Additionally, it's important to recall that the profit fee is included in total project costs. As I mentioned earlier, For SBIR and STTR awards, total project cost encompasses all directs, indirects, and fee. When calculating all of this, your budget will need to account for this additional 7%. And finally, a few common uses for the profit fee. Again, you don't need to justify what you plan to spend the fee on, but a few common things we see applicants use it for are those patent filings or marketing and customer discovery, which are not allowed by direct or indirect costs. And you can also use it to perform additional project activities not planned within the original application. So having gone through that, I'm going to give you a couple tips for balancing your budget. There's a lot of things to keep in mind. Indirect, direct, and fee all add up and not immediately apparent what your total budget will be as you start adding items to a spreadsheet. So what I recommend is to start with a template or spreadsheet that calculates total project costs in real time. That is, accounts for indirect costs and fee when adding fixed cost items. Once you have this, we suggest adding direct costs and other large fixed value expenses first. These include items like materials and supplies, pieces of equipment you intend to buy for the project, any quotes for vendors that you know are fixed, and if you're partnering with a subaward organization, including that quote as well. Once you have those fixed cost items in the budget, you can then adjust personal effort and other items on your spreadsheet to maximize the expenditure by the company. Second, if you're having a hard time meeting the SBIR and STTR minimum thresholds for percentage effort, either internally at your company or externally at your subaward partner, you can consider moving certain items like equipment and material purchases between the SBC and the subaward entity to help balance the internal and external expenditure and hit those SBIR and STTR requirements. Moving certain things like material on the budget have no real impact on the performance of the project activities, simply who's going to pay for it. Third, I'd like to note that there's no penalty for requesting the maximum award amount. This is a common trope we see with many academic investigators who are worried that requesting the maximum amount of the budget will have their applications scored negatively by administrative staff. This is not the case. SBIR and STTR awards are competitive, and we highly recommend you request what you need to perform the project and not leave money on the table. Fourth, we highly recommend that you request the maximum indirect rate. This is especially true for first-time applicants who are unfamiliar with what their indirect cost spend might be for project activities. Often we see applicants underestimate the amount of indirect costs that they'll actually incur during the performance of a project. Additionally, indirect costs are more flexible than direct costs. There are opportunities to discuss with program staff and redirect indirect costs to some direct cost expenditures if you need to during a period of performance. Additionally, indirect costs can also pay for many unforeseen overhead that is going to come up during project execution. These include things like grant accounting and compliance, which are not always immediately apparent to first-time applicants. And finally, we do recommend that you always request a fee. Much like the indirect costs, the profit fee is incredibly flexible, is your incentive to apply to the program, and we highly recommend that you always request it. Having gone through this portion of the budget, I next want to talk about research partners, that is nonprofit research institutions and CROs, and how they're included in the budget and what will be required to include them in the budget. The research partners can be broken down into 3 different categories: subawards, subcontracts, and fee-for-service. For the sake of this discussion, subawards and subcontracts fall into the same category. They are very similar with very minute distinctions. Subaward entities are entities that provide a substantial portion of the project and contribute intellectually to its outcome. They are typically registered in SAM.gov. They must have an assigned UEI, and they will need to provide their own budget and budget justification to the applicant's small business for inclusion in the final award package. Similarly, subcontracted entities also provide a substantial portion of the project and contribute intellectually, but they do not typically have a UEI. However, they should still provide a detailed budget and budget justification. Both distinctions almost always include the addition of key personnel from the pass-through entity on the project team. That is, someone at the subaward or subcontracted entity will typically serve as key personnel, either as a subaward PI or facilitating activities on the project in another manner. Finally, university partners are almost always a subaward or subcontract. Conversely, fee-for-service organizations are typically vendor agreements that are formed between two or more parties, where one party provides a routine service for the other. This is the key distinction between what is often considered a subaward or fee-for-service, whether or not the service provided is routine. Certain CROs and other companies that perform routine work, such as in vitro testing, biocompatibility screening, animal behavior testing, and even some clinical studies can be construed as fee-for-service on an application. Going into a bit more detail about subawards and subcontracts. Recall that for SBIR awards, a university subaward is optional. If you do decide to include a subaward partner on your application, they must perform less than 33% of the work on phase 1 or less than 50% of the work for phase 2. If you are applying to an STTR award, recall that a university subaward is required. They must perform at least 30% of the work on the project. When working with university partners, please be aware that they typically have their own budget templates and will have an established negotiated indirect rate with the federal government. This rate can be higher than you may anticipate. Many universities have rates that can range from 50% and up. So when requesting a budget, think beyond direct cost, and that the actual take line item may be higher than what you expect. A few things to note when preparing this budget with university. If you're working with a subaward PI or a professor or investigator at a university, be aware that the university's pre-award office will often work with this person to develop a final budget and budget justification. The salary for all university personnel will be listed on this subaward budget. This will not be something you list on your company budget. We highly discourage applicants from listing any personnel on both a company budget and a subaward budget, as this can lead to challenges in tracking execution of study objectives, particularly time and effort expenditures. And finally, we note that universities' pre-award office may require both a final budget and justification well ahead of time for approval. I make this final point to note that subawards do take time. In fact, they are one of the top reasons that applicants fail to actually hit the deadline for an SBIR application. So a few tips from working with university partners or forming a subaward or subcontract. First is to make sure to convey to the grant office and the subaward PI creating the budget that the budget caps are for total costs, not just direct costs, which they are often most familiar with. Second, we do recommend that instead of communicating only with the subaward investigator you are working with, to also loop in the pre-award office as early as possible. This is a great opportunity to set hard deadlines, ask them for a date in which you can have all documents by in order to upload and include in your own application. Pivoting back to fee-for-service partners, these are usually listed as other direct costs on most budgets. These organizations are encompassed by contract research organizations, or CROs, as well as other service providers from a wide range of industries. These include software development services, cloud services, different types of device and drug manufacturers, etc. Again, the key distinction of fee-for-service providers is that they offer routine services for the project. They, as an organization, are not doing something custom beyond their normal purview for you as an investigator. This is a service that they offer to anyone and can quote it. In fact, getting costs at a fixed rate and quoted should be something you plan to include in your budget and budget justification. Another key distinction from working with fee-for-service providers is that no intellectual property is usually created as a result of the agreement. A note about working with fee-for-service providers is that, again, all work on SBIR and STTR awards must be performed within the United States. There are some exceptions to this rule that can be made, typically if no US vendor exists to provide this service. However, if you plan to use and attempt to justify a foreign vendor in an SBIR and STTR application, Please note that this will be scrutinized heavily by administrative staff and reviewers, and that the justification must be scientific in nature. Again, the assay is not offered in the US, or they have a special model that only they can provide. Cost is never a good reason to justify foreign components in an SBIR or STTR award. In working with vendors that do have multiple locations across the globe, which you may encounter when you're working with very large CROs that have a global footprint, consider asking the person you're contacting directly for a letter of support stating that the work that's going to be done for this project will be performed at one of their US locations. Knowing the distinction between subawards, subcontracts, and fee-for-service, where do we put these in our budget? Recall that these items are listed as direct costs on the company's budget. Fee-for-service organizations, again, these CROs, product manufacturing analytical services, are typically listed as company internal costs. As such, they tend to contribute to the 67% or 40% minimum SBIR and STTR effort that you need to hit as a company. However, subawards and subcontracts are typically construed as external components. Subawards almost exclusively, and subcontracts can vary a bit. As such, they're going to contribute to that 30% minimum for STTR awards, or that 33% max on SBIR Phase 1 awards. Note that the distinction between fee-for-service and subcontract or subaward can sometimes vary based on the agency you're applying to. So as you prepare the budget and have these quotes coming in, we highly recommend that you contact agency staff and clarify with them whether the funding agency would view this item as either an internal or external cost when it comes to hitting the SBIR and STTR minimum efforts. And to recap, a few tips on working with research partners and balancing your budget as a company. So first, it's highly beneficial that when you start making a subaward package, to give your research partner a maximum before they start working on the budget. These can be calculated upfront just based on the total award amount and the SBIR or STTR minimums. For example, if you're working with the NIH and you have a $300,000 total cost limit for a Phase 1 SBIR, you know that the total subaward budget cannot exceed $99,000. That is 33% of the total work to be done. Conversely, for an STTR, where the subaward budget can be at minimum 30% and at maximum 60%, you know that their total subaward budget cannot exceed $180,000. When making this request, we highly recommend that you try to factor in other fixed cost items ahead of time. That is to say, if they're going to need to be below that $99,000 threshold, let them know up front. This can avoid some back and forth, and as subawards and subcontracts and even quotes can take many weeks to get, this can avoid some back and forth and the need to rebudget. Again, another tip to balancing is to move some of those direct costs for fixed items like materials and equipment between your budget as a company and to the research partner. This can help you hit those SBIR and STTR minimums. Another tip, if a staff member or key personnel at a university is only contributing a small amount to the project, consider asking the university and the investigator whether they can be moved from the subaward payroll and act as a consultant directly to the company instead. Consultants may not incur overhead from the university partner, which can reduce total cost of the subaward on your budget while still allowing you to include this person in your project. And then finally, start early. Subawards, again, are the #1 reason we see applicants fail to hit a deadline. And knowing that starting several weeks in advance can help you plan accordingly. Having gone through the budget, I now want to switch gears a little bit and talk about key personnel and some gap analyses, and then we'll pivot into post-award procedures and expectations. So first, recall that for SBIR and STTR awards, the key personnel you're trying to gather for your team are focused around product development. This team should have a broad expertise in science and commercialization. This is in contrast to many academic grants, which are typically composed of a limited team of experts. These are typically key opinion leaders, a faculty or professor, internal and external collaborators, postdocs, graduate students, etc., that are usually focused specifically on the science of the project, and accommodate all the expertise required to execute it. For SBIR and STTR grants, the goal again is product development. This involves taking items outside of an initial discovery stage and moving it to the market. This requires an amount of skill and expertise that is not typically found within a single person, nor is it expected to exist within a single person. This includes things like strategic partners for follow-on clinical studies, business advisors to help keep your company afloat, regulatory experts should you need to touch base with the FDA on moving your product to market, as well as investors to make sure they can finance gaps in your product development plan. You need to build your team to support all of these efforts beyond just the execution of your project. And importantly, reviewers are looking for this when they look at your application. Your team is part of the review criteria for almost every single agency that you're going to apply to, shown here at the NIH, but this also applies for the NSF and DoD. This is a key distinction between academic and SBIR and STTR awards, where for these academic awards, they're looking for investigators who have lots of publications, have successfully executed research projects in the past through federal funding, whereas SBIR and STTR teams are expected to encompass a broad range of skills encompassing project management and commercialization experience. These reviewers are looking at two groups of personnel in your application when making this distinction. First is key personnel. Key personnel includes the project PI, as well as key members of the SB team or at the subaward, such as the subaward PI. This will also include members of the team that are listed as consultants. These can be scientific, regulatory, or clinical or business consultants. A few notes. The key personnel are often required to provide a biosketch or a CV. This is something you, as an applicant, can use to your advantage. By listing someone as a consultant or key personnel, it gives you an opportunity to highlight people on your team who have expertise relevant to this aspect of the project. If you have someone who's commercialized a product in this space before, who's working as a partner, add them as key personnel so you can highlight that to the reviewers that that's part of your team. You can also add consultants specifically to fill these crucial gaps in the company's subaward. If you have, when considering consultants, we ask you to think about your projects or product's trajectory to market and what hurdles you will need to cross to get there. Opposed to key personnel, other personnel is rather simple. This is used for generic product activities, things like programming, animal technician, laboratory technician, or laboratory manager. For other personnel who are not providing a large amount of intellectual input into the project or deciding on its direction, you can list them as such. You do not require a biosketch, CV, or additional justification. In fact, they do not need to be listed by name. Knowing what the reviewers are going to be looking for, it's useful to conduct a gap analysis of your company and team and understand where you need to be in 5 to 10 years from now and how will you get there. So first question that many companies need to ask is who will be the PI on my project? Many times this can be a subject matter expert. This could be an accomplished entrepreneur who works in a similar space. It might be the CEO of your company. It might be a professor at a university who's the inventor of the technology. Again, recalling that who can serve as the PI can determine SBIR and STTR eligibility, with the PI being required to work at the small business concern for SBIR awards at least 51% of the time. However, once you decide on the PI, it's important to recall again that the PI does not need to do everything. Teamwork is the name of the game. So what supporting personnel does the PI need? Well, this depends heavily on the project that you actually plan to execute. If you're performing drug discovery, you might consider adding someone who's a medicinal chemist, toxicologist, or expert in vitro assays. If you need to perform preclinical animal testing, you may need a veterinarian. And if you're executing a clinical trial, it may be prudent to consider partnering with a clinician of the team or adding a biostatistician into the mix to help support development of your protocol and analyze study results. Knowing what you need, you can then ask, is there a person at my company or lab or organization that has that expertise? If so, it's important to consider asking them if they would be willing to serve as key personnel in your application. If not, you can consider asking or contacting colleagues to assist with the projects and pay them as consultants. This will again allow you to highlight the resume and biosketch in your application and show off their expertise to the reviewers. And finally, I would highlight that commercialization is a factor in SBIR and STTR awards. While marketing research is not something you can pay for with grant funding, you can include advisors on the budget who are going to help guide the company. These include regulatory personnel, as well as business advisors to help round out the team and show that you're poised for commercialization beyond completion of the SBIR program. One final note that I'd like to make is to keep in mind this is a proposed team when you submit your application. The personnel do not need to be working at the company during submission. They can be hired at time of award. Additionally, it is quite common that personnel will move or new folks will be added to the team in between submission and time of award, and these can be adjusted accordingly. So as we wrap up, I just want to touch base briefly on post-award procedures and expectations. So to recall, I want to impress upon you that the award process is a long one. From submission to project start, you are typically looking at about 6 to 9 months from the time you first submit your SBIR application, following review by independent panels and external investigators, the agency itself, and actually being notified of project award start. Most of you are probably focused right now on the submission phase, but when it comes time to actually start the project, there are a few things to be aware of. And these are going to come about in the form of pre-award negotiations, where you'll be asked to finalize budgets and teams, provide certain certifications, and provide approvals for things like IRB and IACIRC if you're working with human subjects or vertebrate animals. A specific example from the NIH, if your application was selected for award, a program official would approve the proposal and the PI or point of contact for the business would be contacted for additional information during pre-award negotiations. These are going to include filing of SBIR and STTR agreement, certifying that your company meets the requirements for the program. They may also ask for a financial evaluation of your company. This includes balance sheets and income statements or any work that you performed in the past several years. They'll ask for other support for key personnel to make sure there are no conflicts for anyone working on the project. They may also ask you to adjust your budget if needed, and if all these things proceed, you will receive notice of award. It's important to note that after notice of award, your funds are received on a defined schedule or through a cost reimbursement process, and you will also need a financial management system to document these costs and request reimbursement. A few other things to consider post-award, and again, this is not exhaustive, and there are definitely services that can help you navigate these. But they include written policies and procedures like billing, timekeeping, record keeping and purchasing, project cost accounting system, and adequate timekeeping for all personnel. These are items that many first-time applicants don't consider when applying for SBIR and STTR awards, but we impress upon you that they will be something you need to consider after the award's there. Note, you don't need to have these services right now. There are companies available to provide them for you. And again, coming all the way back to the beginning, I'd like to impress upon you that you can pay for these using company indirect costs, and to always, always, always request the maximum indirect rate if you are able to, so that you can cover these items after the award starts. On behalf of EGC, I'd like to thank you all for attending today. I hope you walked away from this presentation on grant budgeting with more knowledge than you came here with. At this point, I would like to open up the discussion and questions, and thank you all.
Hey, Brandon, I did notice that Nico in the very beginning had asked a question, and then Chelsea asked to defer to you. It says, one criticism from reviewers I have seen in the past is that the budget is focused too much on salaries and not enough on equipment. How should the budget be tailored when the project only needs person hours to be successful?
In that case, I would highly recommend you add additional justification to your budget to clarify that the work performed by the investigators is all-encompassing. Additionally, you can also discuss your budget with the program officer on your award or for your application to understand what specific criteria the reviewers may have been commenting on, that the budget wasn't directed towards something else.
see.
Okay. Any other questions?
I believe Chelsea had answered a lot of questions. Great job, Chelsea. She was tagging away.
There was a couple that I did also. So one other one was, can PIs come from the same organization, for example, within the same small business? And under what circumstances would multiple PIs be considered a multiple PI PD situation?
That is an interesting question. So multiple PIs can come from the same institution. The distinction between when you would need a multiple PDPI plan comes with, I guess, deciding on who is going to ultimately have control or say over the direction of the project. If it's one investigator who is going to run the show, or 70-30 distinction of power on the dispersion of funds, then you may not need it. But if you are going to split the work and effort and IP 50-50, then a multiple PDPI plan may be something you want to include.
And then we do have a couple questions about how total costs and also the indirect costs are calculated. So if you could just briefly run through basic calculations for how you would actually derive your indirect cost and then your total cost for a project.
Yes, absolutely. So your direct costs will be the first bucket that you tally up. These are all your line items. Your indirect costs will be whatever portion of that direct cost is considered your base. Again, that can vary. So I advise you check the NOFO or confer with program staff to confirm what we'll actually consider a base. That is multiplied by your percentage rate. And then the total indirect cost that you've calculated from that added to your directs is your total project cost, which you then take 7% of to get the final including fee.
And I did get a chance to answer this in the comments, but since we do have some time, I think this would be good for everyone to hear, but what are the minimum efforts required for budgets?
In what terms? Do you mean the personnel or?
That's how I interpreted it, yeah.
Okay, so minimum effort for personnel is difficult and it's typically designed as reasonable for the project. However, for STTRs, there is a minimum of at least 10%, so 1.2 months per calendar year for anyone listed as a PI on that application. For, I would say in SBIR, so long as the effort is contingent upon the work to be done in the application, there typically is no real minimum. However, I would say 10% is typically a good number that reviewers will deem as acceptable in a project.
I believe one person had, where did I see it then? Bumping this question.
Good question. Can you hire a foreign scientist for a limited task as a contractor?
Yeah.
This would again require some pretty significant justification. And the NIH or NSF would probably ask you why this particular expertise cannot be found in the US. So I would highly recommend looking for someone within the US to do that work.
I think there's a follow-up on the multiple PI question of, so I'm hearing that it depends on whether the PIs will be sharing responsibility or ownership of the budget and outcomes. I think in terms of, I think the answer is, or the question is getting at who would be classified as a PI.
Yeah, so who is classified as a PI? I mean, designating someone as a PI on a project assigns them some authority to execute the study and basically decide on how funds are dispersed. The funding agency typically wants to see a multiple PDPI plan to ensure that disagreements between parties who share equal power on the project are not going to disrupt the actual performance of the project. So if you have designated 2 people as co-owners of this project on your application, then they're sharing this 50-50. I would recommend including the multiple PDPI plan to kind of de-risk that from the perspective of the reviewers so they know disagreements are not going to result in any issues in actually completing the project.
I think we're at the end of our questions. I'm not sure. Sahar said, I was flat out told they will not accept foreign involvement for political reasons.
Yeah. Hey, this is Sahar. So I talked to a couple of people. One of them was a NIAD PO, and the other one was an IBIB. The NIBIB person kind of really made a face when I said, hey, I have someone in Canada who is the inventor of this product that I'd like to continue to collaborate with. She said that's really difficult. The NIAD person flat out said, don't do it, find a US counterpart, because even if you could justify it, and it's going to be really difficult to justify it for political reasons, it's likely to get nixed, meaning that the congressman who's supporting this program really wants to go out and say this was fully done to support US and American businesses and not have the money go elsewhere. That's the feedback that I received, and that was about a couple of weeks ago.
Thank you for sharing. There are new review criteria within the NIH to comment on whether or not foreign components are involved, and there is a lot of scrutiny on whether or not you plan to use foreign components. So yes, the bar is quite high to justify work done outside the US.